I'm going to move now to this minimal fact, and I'm going to use the New Testament the way skeptics use the New Testament. And I'm going to argue that if you use data scholars allow, Jesus has been raised from the dead. Now, let me just start with the provocative comment from one of the top historical Jesus scholars around. I believe he called himself a liberal. His name is E.P. Sanders. He recently retired from Duke. He used to teach at Oxford. He's got a couple books out that changed the course of New Testament scholarship, very reputable. He wrote a little book, I believe 1993. It's called The Human Figure of Jesus. And he starts with data scholars know. Data that scholars know about the historical Jesus. And guess what he says when it comes to the aftermath of Jesus' death? He's telling you what scholars believe today, what critics believe. And he says, scholars agree that after his death, Jesus appeared to his early disciples. And then he says this twice in the book, Jesus appeared to his disciples. How he appeared, exactly how he appeared, I'm not prepared to say. But twice he says, my point is, he's not even giving his view. He's telling you what the consensus of scholarship is today. And he says, Jesus appeared to his early followers. Skeptics concede that much? Well, I've got an article on my website. You can check it out, GaryHabermas.com. It's underneath the Articles tab. It's an article published in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, which is a critical journal. It's interesting. I'm an evangelical. When I sent them the material, they called me and they said, you want us to consider this for publication, right? Yeah. A little embarrassed to tell you this, but if you knew what our journal was about, you'd know we don't publish things on resurrection because we think that Jesus' life ended on Good Friday. Do you still want us to consider your article? I had a little egg on my face because I hadn't read their précis on what their journal does. It was just Bill Craig said to me, he goes, hey, you want to publish this? Man, it'd be a coup if you got into the Journal for Study of Historical Jesus. Why don't you send it to them? Well, he hadn't read it either. He hadn't read the précis either. They said, we don't take articles in this, but do you want us to send it out to our readers? You know, we don't want them, but I said, I had to keep a stiff upper lip, right? Yeah, send it out, see what they say. All right. Called me a few months later and they said, guess what? We're going to do a whole issue on resurrection. Yours is going to be the lead article. Now, here's what's interesting. I'm an evangelical, right? My article is on what critical scholars believe on the resurrection. They're letting me tell them what they believe. I'm not saying that's horrible. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that like in a making fun of way. I'm just saying these data are out there and you can find what the critics are saying. And that's what I'm going to be using here, okay? So I'm going to cut this gap down considerably because I'm going to use two passages from Paul. And you go, but there you go again, using the New Testament. Critics use the New Testament. They will use it. If you don't, they will use it. Because they think like studying Homer or something else. In fact, they'd say, don't even compare it to Homer. It's way better than Homer. But they'd say there's some texts that are better accepted than others. Here's an example. They'd say, the Apostle Paul has 13 books that bear his name. Now here's a skeptic talking. They're going to say, we're not going to let you use those 13 books because we think a lot of them were written by Paul. We'll let you use 6 or 7 of the books. They call these the authentic epistles. And if you doubt what I'm saying, pick up Bart Ehrman's Introduction to the New Testament, and you can see he will list all these books as acceptable books to use because Paul's a known quantity. He's a scholar who changed his mind, who was at the right people, right time, knew the brothers and disciples of Jesus, was a leader before he became a Christian, leader of his people. He was a religious scholar. Paul is an honest writer. Inspired? No. Scholars don't talk, skeptics don't talk like that. Not inspired, but he's honest. He knows the sources. He'll tell you the right state of things. You have to have a reason to disbelieve Paul. But I'll only let you use 6 of his books. Well, you have a decision to make. If you're going to grad school, it's not wise to sit there and go, no, I want to argue for the books you don't accept. Don't think you're getting your PhD. But what if you just take the data they give you? And what are they going to give you unanimously? Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. They'll always give you those sources. Now I'm going to use a text from 2 of those books. Virtually nobody will tell you these are not authoritative. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we started with it, and the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2. Those 2 texts. All right, where are we on our timeline? 1 Corinthians is written about 55 AD. Some will say 58, some will say 54, 53. I mean, 55 is a fair date. And we're at plus 25. Earlier than the Gospels. And I think we should use the Gospels. I think we need people who are going to do dissertations on the Gospels and reestablish their authority, and they're coming back in right now. I'll just say, the best book on this topic right now is Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Almost 500 pages from a Cambridge University scholar saying there's eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels, we need to use them. But they're going to grant you that Paul's in the right place at the right time. So for right now, I'm going to take Paul and run. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul started, just to remind you again, Paul says, when I came to you, I gave you the gospel. This is the gospel I preached. And depending on how you responded, that determines where you are vis-a-vis Christianity. He says whether you're saved or not. Then verse 3, I gave you what I was given. Now it's very, very important, and that's why the critics like Paul. Because in the New Testament, there are a bunch of early creedal statements. We can pursue this during the Q&A if you want, but these early creedal statements are early texts that predate the book in which they're written. There are dozens of them in the New Testament. And many of the best ones, best as in early, go back to the 30s AD. And so Paul is the right guy, right place, scholar. He knows the disciples and brothers of Jesus. He's checked out the sources, as you'll see. And he says, I gave you what I was given. This is when he wrote it, a mere plus 25. He says in the first 2 verses, the same message I gave when I came to you. When did he come to Corinth? Some people say this is the most easily identified date in the New Testament. He comes to Corinth 51 to 52 AD. We know because there's an inscription with the name of the leader of Corinth. He held a post mentioned in the New Testament, and we're told that he was in charge when Paul came to Corinth. There's an inscription that's been found, and what's really interesting about this is that these Greek leaders only served for 1 year. So it was 51 to 52 AD. All right, so Paul writes this material. Paul taught the same thing to them, plus 21. Paul says, I gave you what I was given. When, where, and from whom did Paul receive this material? Well, let me give you the critical conclusion, and then I'll give you the data for it. Richard Bauckham says, in this book I referred to, he calls us a New Testament consensus. Now, I've been saying this for 35 years, actually, that this argument that we can get this material back to 35. But Richard Bauckham says at one time in one book, and everyone says, Richard Bauckham says it because he's that respectable. Cambridge University, he says it's a consensus New Testament position that Paul received this material about 35 AD. How would you know that? We don't have any books from that time. How do we know Paul checked this stuff out in 35 AD? Paul's an authoritative source. We're using one of the authoritative books, and Paul does the math for us. Let's do the math. Here's the cross. When did Paul become a Christian? Now, another way, if you prefer, another way to ask this is how soon is Acts 9 after Acts 1? Some people put Paul's conversion, the Damascus experience, where he had an experience that he believed to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. Some people put that at plus 1. That's a minority view, but some people put a plus 1. Plus 2 is quite popular. 2 or 3 are the most popular views. Somebody's going to say 4. But the most popular views are the Damascus experience, or Acts 9, is about 2 to 3 years after Acts 1. So, Paul's conversion is about, let's just do 2 real quickly. He comes to the Lord, he believes he sees the Lord, comes a +2. And then he says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 16, he says, I met the Lord. And then he says, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. I spent 3 years with the Lord in Arabia, and then I went up to Jerusalem to see the apostles. Okay? Here's the math again. If Paul comes at +2, he spends 3 years with the Lord and then goes up to Jerusalem at the end of 3 years. 2 + 3, 5. Go, well, I think Paul's conversion was +3. Okay, good. +3, goes with Jerusalem, 36 AD, +6. And so, Baucham's consensus view that Paul comes up, and you can get a whole list of guys who say that he was in Jerusalem a maximum of 6 years after the cross. So this is really, really early. Now, what's this based on? Well, in Galatians 1:18, Paul says, then I went up to Jerusalem after 3 years, and I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of the Lord.